How goes it with your spirit? Are you as tired as I am? I remember blue laws. These were predominant in New England and the Atlantic states as being a leftover from the Puritan days when there was to be no work performed on Sunday. Most businesses were closed on that day. One could not go shopping, go to a restaurant, purchase alcohol. Some states still banned the sale of alcohol, and for some weird reason, the sale of automobiles. The world had essentially shut down for one day during the week. So what our family did on Sundays was attend church in the morning and then in the afternoon go to my grandparents. Sometimes it was my father's parents where they had a ritual of popping popcorn and playing Scrabble. Or my mother's parents where a card game of pinochle might occur, and of course, Sunday dinner. It was a break in the routine. It was hopefully a day when one was surrounded by loved ones who loved you no matter what. The day refreshed the spirit for the grind that began again on Monday morning. The notion of the Sabbath in this regard has, for the most part, disappeared in favor of the capitalist craving for making a profit. There is, however, a need in the human psyche to have some time that is set aside that is different from any other activity we might engage in. And given our current situation with an administration that is actively seeking to embody George Orwell novels, reversing any rights and environmental justice mandates made in the previous administration, and encouraging our darker selves to strike out against whoever is seen as the other du jour, there is a need for the capacity to take some time to center ourselves in order for us to maintain and sustain our own sense of integrity and calling. Susan Frederick Gray said it best when she said, "This is no time for a casual faith. We must be bold in siding with love." Our faith has incorporated, as being central to being Unitarian Universalist, the desire for justice to be created for all, the marginalized, the oppressed, and the abused and exploited earth with all of its inhabitants. We look and see the inhumanity at the border, so we seek to provide humanitarian aid in the form of water to those being funneled to cross the only opening in the wall, the Sonoa Desert. We find that compassionate aid being criminalized. We protest the inhumane treatment of migrants and the traumatizing of children. We look and see a woman's right to choose being criminalized, and so we provide escorts to women entering Planned Parenthood for their health care. We look and see voting rights being stripped away, so we rally and petition and pass constitutional amendments to re-enfranchise nonviolent felons, only to have the state pass legislation requiring a restitution fine before they can be restored their rights. This is another word for the unconstitutional poll tax from the 1950s. We see blacks being targeted, shot, or incarcerated by police for crimes that whites commit but are not arrested. We see white rapists given time served and black rapists getting life sentences. We see the disabled being stripped of their equal access to education. Transgender folks being denied service to their country in the military. We see indigenous people being stripped of their right to protest oil pipelines across their lands. Environmental protections of our waterways being discarded, allowing for factory and mining toxins to once again dump into our watersheds and reservoirs. National parks that were sanctuaries for animals being opened up for hunting and fossil fuel mining. The list of injustices grows by leaps and bounds. I haven't even mentioned the white nationalist hate mongering that is on an increase in this nation. And all of this is the reversal of rights and protections won in previous generations. And I haven't mentioned the injustices that still need to be addressed to bring us closer to our aspirational, more perfect union. The anxiety is palpable among marginalized groups, immigrants, LGBTQ, Muslims, blacks. So how can we continue to plug away to offer loving kindness, to create justice, and walk humbly with this life without burning out like a candle with flames burning on both ends? In the Hebrew creation myth, after God had created the whole world in 6 days, God was pleased, and so on the 7th day, God rested from their creating, and it was good. Later in the Hebrew story, God commands Moses to keep the Sabbath, the 7th day, holy. There were all sorts of restrictions placed on how one was to do this. The people were to set aside 1 day a week that was to be different from all the other days of the week. This distinction was to aid the people in knowing whose they were and to refrain from all work. Because the Hebrews were an agricultural society, the work refrained from had to do with crop and animal husbandry. They also refrained from garment making, curing of hides, and construction. Imagine how difficult and strenuous all these tasks would be for an ancient people. The need for a day of rest was not only a religious act, but a requirement for healthy living. Any bodybuilder will tell you that they need to alternate their routine to allow for muscles to rest and be restored. The need for a Sabbath was important in bringing the people of Israel together as one people. It allowed them to rejuvenate their spirits so that they would be able to continue the work laid out for them. Now, I posted this question on Facebook to find out how people were experiencing Sabbath rest in their lives, given all of the injustices I mentioned. One person saw the question as seeking to return to follow a set of religious rituals, a very concrete, legalistic definition of the Sabbath. The prohibitions that Orthodox Jews follow is not what I was referring to when I used the word Sabbath rest. I am looking at the spirit of the Sabbath, not the letter of the Sabbath. How do we care for ourselves? Do we take time out and make it holy so we can rejuvenate our spirits, our sense of integrity, our convictions of our faith? Time in which to rest those muscles so that they become stronger and healthier to be able to carry on the work at hand. The Hebrew mandate to keep the Sabbath and make it holy is following the letter of the law. Making something holy does not occur through a set of rituals that one performs. There may be a physical marker that help remind us that this time is being set aside as holy. But those physical markers in and of themselves are not what makes it holy. In Fiddler on the Roof, the family gathers around the table for Shabbat and light candles and says prayers to mark this time as different from any other time. We light a chalice at the beginning of our worship to set this time together apart from other parts of our days. It is not the lighting of candles or saying prayers that make a time holy. It is the desire of the heart, the allowing of the inner self, as Socrates might say, to become one with the outer self. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, in Gift of the Sea, talks about this as living in grace. She writes, I would like to achieve a state of inner spiritual grace from which I could function and give as I was meant to in the eye of God. Setting aside time for the holy, a time that is set apart from everything else, is a time for developing that state of inner spiritual grace. There is a need to rejuvenate ourselves so that we do not feel the weight of the world and feel defeated, which, given the daily onslaught of news, is easy to slide into feeling. So one person admitted to feeling guilty to taking time for themselves when they have friends who are on the constant high alert for ICE raids or are being confronted with microaggressions and blatant racial attacks daily. Having in the back of one's mind that at any moment they could be in a racially charged environment is an anxiety-provoking, life-threatening act. Such acts are happening with more frequency because they are being given permission that somehow it is patriotic to tell someone who does not look like them that they do not belong here. A simple traffic stop can suddenly go wrong for our black siblings, and that fear is constantly present. How do these individuals find Sabbath from the deluge of vitriolic attacks? They find Sabbath rest by carving out black and immigrant spaces. This is not being segregationist. This is survival respite strategies for their own mental, emotional, and spiritual health. How can my white privileged friend take a day off from justice making when their siblings of color do not dare? They struggle with this question. Yet they must find a way to care for their own physical, emotional, and spiritual needs, or fail to be any good in supporting their friend's quest to remove the chains of oppression. So they find the time to care for themselves. They carve out a morning here and there to focus their energy elsewhere. They choose time to be with friends and set boundaries on conversation topics. Their justice work has boundaries as well. They focus on certain issues rather than participating in every cause. This is not a Sabbath rest in the Hebrew religious sense, but it is a Sabbath rest if it becomes restorative for the person. Another friend told me that they use their worship music to draw in a sense of peace. They also take a moment to focus on their family. Without these moments, they know that their body and mind react negatively. Another leans on their community of friends. They dance and listen to music to help refocus their energy. And another friend takes time to go hiking in rural areas to remind themselves of their interconnectedness with life and their higher power. This time enables them to return to their day to day with renewed hope for their future. Many years ago, during the height of the AIDS pandemic in this country, I was struggling with what my next steps would be to ensure that the services of a small AIDS ministry that I co-founded was going to continue. We had lost our meager funding. Our part-time director resigned. I was contemplating stepping down from the board presidency to assume the role of directorship on a full-time basis, even though there was no money and the possibility of money seemed out of reach. It was a difficult time. One evening in my despair over the situation, I took a walk. I carved out this time to ponder, even though a realistic solution seemed elusive. My walk took me to a pond. I looked out at the water, and it was smooth as glass. And there were 2 swans swimming on this pond, and yet they caused no ripple in the water. I stood there in the silence and listened for the sound of the swans paddling. I was taken by the silence in that moment, transfixed, as it were. There seemed to be no possible way for these swans to glide forward without troubling the water. Yet there they were. And in that moment, I knew I was in the presence of a Sabbath, a time set apart as holy, a moment when the inner man and the outer man were one, a moment of living in grace. And regardless of how troubling the times were for people living with AIDS, the constant fear of being tossed out of apartments, of having families of deceased loved ones overturn wills and evicting them from their own homes, I knew in that moment I would be able to move forward like the swans in serving people living with AIDS. That Sabbath time refocused, recentered me to continue the work I felt called to do at that time. If we as Unitarian Universalists feel called to help create justice in Manatee County, in Florida, in the nation, in whatever way that call may arise, then creating a way to experience a Sabbath rest is vital to the way of justice. It will enable us to remain centered when the news is disheartening and even vicious against us and those we love. Blessed be.